Okay, so here is my digital storytelling presentation about my 2 unit plans. Alright, so some of my teaching strategies that I use. For the elementary level, I use self-monitoring, and at the secondary level, I focused on self-determination, cultural diversity, and transition and community-based skills. So here is just an overview of my unit plan for the secondary and elementary level. At the elementary level, we worked with measurement, so we looked at mass, length, and volume, and by doing that, we did a lot of group work and partner work. We had the students trace their partner's hands, and then another activity we did their feet with their shoes on. They used cubes and stuck them together to focus on using non-standard units of measurement for length, and we used a balance scale for mass, just getting them to do hands-on activities to learn about measurement. The secondary level, we focused on classification and graphing. Unfortunately, with the time constraints with the secondary unit in particular, we didn't have time to go over the specific kingdoms and phylums in classes. We did use a dichotomous key to try to classify that way, so it did look at the kingdoms and phylums in classes. However, they didn't have to know the characteristics of those kingdoms necessarily, just looking at using the key and classifying that way. Alright, so curriculum-based measurements. I did more of informal assessments, with the time constraints that I had. I didn't think it was effective use of time to use pre and post testing, so I just looked at observations and discussions that the students had and took down notes, and then I also used lab assignments and collected classwork to get my measurements that way. Alrighty, and so here are the graphs to represent that. At the elementary level, I took a data point for length, mass, and volume, and you'll notice that at the end they're tend to taper in the negative direction, and that's simply because that was taken at volume, and volume I think is a little more of an abstract concept at that level. It was difficult for them to grasp that fully just because it's not something that they use in the everyday life. When I think of volume, I think of cooking or being in the kitchen, and I think that they haven't had that connection yet. So we tried to make that for them with the unit plan and help them with that through hands-on activities, but again, it's a little bit more of an abstract concept, and with the time constraints, that's why we noticed this here in the graph. So this is my secondary graph, and looking at classification, and I was very happy with the way that the students performed and how they ended up participating and really being excited about the hands-on activities that we used. So for classification, like I said, one of the activities that we did was a dichotomous key, which they enjoyed, focused on scientific and logical reasoning and problem solving, and then the other introduction was a fingerprinting lesson. And that was interesting for them. They got to classify their own fingerprint patterns, which was very interesting. Alright, so at the secondary level, talk about some of the differences between that with the elementary. So the students were not afraid to speak their mind during lessons, and what that means is just that they were not afraid to share their opinions on the lesson or make comments about what time the lesson was going to be over, when they would be out of the class, or that they didn't want to do that particular activity. So initially they weren't willing to share their thoughts and opinions. They were kind of shut down, and I guess being the stereotypical high schooler. But throughout the lessons we were able to, get them to open up, and through discussion and praise, they were able to really be able to share their thoughts and opinions, which was really awesome to see. The content was different, obviously. Some of the similarities, students needed reinforcement and guidance, and I worked at the secondary level with a self-contained class, and the elementary level was a kindergarten class, so both of these groups of students needed a lot of probing and a lot of guidance and reassurance. Students were eager to participate in hands-on activities. I know previously that I said that they weren't as willing to get involved and weren't as excited about the lesson, but once I told them what the activities were and that they were hands-on and they would be doing these things themselves, they were a lot more excited. Students became more comfortable self-monitoring. Students enjoyed representing themselves in various ways. So at the elementary level, the students were very eager to please. If you've ever been to kindergarten classroom, you know this firsthand. They always have their hand up and want to be called on and ready to be involved in what you're talking about. And the students were willing to answer questions and share their thoughts and opinions. So that's always something nice to be able to work with. And then the content was obviously different than the secondary because it was measurement. So some of the strengths and weaknesses. At the elementary level, the strengths were student participation, which I just kind of touched on, and the hands-on activities they really enjoyed. And the weaknesses were the student focus. They were new to group work. So earlier I talked about some of the hands-on activities being that they trace their partner's footprint and handprint and use the cubes to measure with non-standard units. This was something new to them. They hadn't done any type of partner work or group work at that level. So this was something that took a little bit of time to get them to focus on the actual assignment as opposed to focusing on working with a partner. And then again, which I've talked about briefly, were the time constraints was another weakness. The secondary level, the strengths were the ability to connect to real-life skills and career choices. So with the fingerprinting activity and classification that way, we were able to touch on, police and investigators, private detectives, lawyers, judges, all different career choices in the future that will use these kind of classification skills. So that was something really cool for them to see, and we were able to talk about crime shows, which is something that they watch. So that was very interesting. And then again, hands-on activities was a strength. The weaknesses, which I touched on briefly, was the initial attitude towards the activity and the time constraints, as well as the resources. And what that means is just, unfortunately, with the resources we have, each student wasn't able to do the hands-on activity. We kind of had to share, which worked out fine, but in a realistic world, I would rather have them doing the dichotomous key out, actually looking at the specimen instead of just reading about something on paper. So here's some of the sample work from the fingerprinting lesson. As you can see, here are the fingerprints, and I didn't use ink pads. Again, with the resources, we made our own ink pads using lead pencil and just coloring really darkly onto another notepad, sticking our fingers into it, taping it, and then putting that onto our note card so we could compare these to the fingerprinting sheet to see what their fingerprint patterns were. And they really enjoyed this. Okay, let's see. So, reflections and insights. At the elementary level, like I said, the topics were somewhat abstract, which struggled to keep them focused when they're not connecting and it's not something that they see every day. It's harder for you to connect to their prior knowledge and background knowledge. So I definitely will have to think about that in the future, about how to get that connection made. And constant guidance and observations during work and labs. Just at such a young level, at the kindergarten level, like I've said, just making sure that you have that with-itness and you're not only talking to these children and working with them one-on-one, but you're paying attention to what all the other students are doing in the class, especially when working with partners and using pencils and markers. You got to make sure that they're not drawing on each other or drawing on the wall. So you really have to be all-knowing when you're in the classroom. And just an insight, I just love their enthusiasm. It's always exciting to see kindergartners so eager to learn new topics. The secondary level, I enjoyed working with older students. This is my first time ever being in high school and even at the secondary level at all. So that was definitely interesting. I'm not used to students that are taller than me. And they were connected to the same type of interests that I were. So it was very interesting and cool for me to talk to them about crime scene shows and fingerprinting. That's something that, at the elementary level is not something that you're probably going to be able to talk about them with CSI or Criminal Minds. So that was something really interesting. We could connect on that level. And then relating the authentic skills to possible career choices. This was something that was really cool for me. I feel like at the high school level, I guess definitely when I was there, it wasn't we were told that we needed these skills, but they didn't necessarily connect them to what we'd be using in real life. So for me to be able to do that with this lesson was pretty awesome, and that they actually related to that and thought that that was cool was cool. And then the in-depth discussions that you have. I'm definitely a promoter of discussion at any level. I think that all kids are capable of discussion and deep thinking. At this level, it was just interesting to see that discussion, especially, like I said, with authentic skills and career choices that they're talking about. So it was cool to get to actually visualize their thinking. So that was a little bit about my 2 unit plans and how they were a little bit different, how they also were the same. So hopefully you guys can take something away from that. And thanks for watching.